Hi, in this video I'm going to discuss Immanuel Kant's Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, and I'm going to focus just on the preface of this text. So I'll be making another video where I discuss chapter 1. Kant wrote this book as a kind of practical summation of the conclusions he arrived at in his longer work, The Critique of Practical Reason. Um, and what the text essentially tries to offer is an approach to ethics that's grounded in an understanding of reason. And so prior to Kant, the idea had been that the purpose of ethics was to provide you with a set of values that you could live your life by in order to act virtuously, which is an idea gained from the Greeks. And this is particularly prevalent in Aristotle, who thought that the purpose of ethics was to enable you to live virtuously. And for Aristotle, virtue constituted a kind of disposition in which one always occupies the middle ground between two extremes. And in his book, The Ethics, the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle lists loads and loads of different types of virtues, and he always situates each virtue in between two extremes. He calls it the golden mean. So, for example, for Aristotle, to take the notion of courage, to act courageously is, on the one hand, not to jump into a situation without first analyzing it, so not to be too rash, too overzealous, and thereby to have a little bit of fear, a little bit of anxiety in the face of danger, but at the same time also not to let that fear paralyze one and make one unable to act. So courage is the kind of neither too much fear nor too little, but just the right amount in order to rationally respond to a situation. This is Aristotle's approach to ethics, and you could say it's a type of rationalism. And his idea was that if you acted virtuously in every aspect of your life, then you could become happy. Now, for him, happiness doesn't constitute a emotional state. It constitutes a kind of contentment. We might translate it more as a kind of satisfaction with one's existence. A satisfaction that's not necessarily grounded in anything material, but a kind of personal satisfaction with oneself, a sense of personal security, rooted in a life based on virtue. Right? So there's loads of virtues: honesty, courage, and so forth and so on. There's many of them. So Kant, although Kant accepts that this is an important aspect of ethics, of course one should try to act virtuously, he doesn't think that it constitutes the sole purpose of ethical discourse. One of Aristotle's main critiques, Kant's main critiques of the ethics of his time was the kind of obsession with Aristotle, the obsession with virtue, and this is very much also prevalent in the philosophy of utilitarianism, which argues that the purpose of ethics is to enable the greatest amount of people to be happy, even if this involves some suffering for a minority of people. The greatest majority, maximize the pleasure for the greatest majority. Aristotle thought this, or Kant thought this was deeply mistaken. And so what you'll find in Kant is an ethics that's grounded, number one, in reason, so similar to Aristotle, a rationalist ethics, but one that isn't defined by any particular situation. So Kant says you can't know whether to act morally based on empirical situations, like, for example, the trolley problem. For Kant, this is effectively a non-issue. The idea of the the trolley that's going to run into 5 people on one side of the tracks and one person on the other side of the tracks. This old kind of, in some ways, boring problem at this point. But Kant would say this is a non-issue. Instead, what Kant is going to establish is that the purpose of ethics is to enable you to act in accordance with duty. What Kant wants to seek is a set of principles that you must follow, and that would be rational. So you don't need any kind of religious text. Kant was in many ways, some people have said he was an atheist. He rejects the authority of any kind of religious text because he says that everything that a religious text could give us is also present in the power of reason, the power of rational activity, and that one could know whether or not to act morally by using one's rational abilities. And Kant's going to call this the categorical imperative, the imperative that commands you to act in a way and to always act in this way irrespective of the circumstances. Okay, so I want to turn now to the text, and I'm only going to focus on the preface, and I'm really just going to read through it and then comment on it. It's not very long, but I think the preface is a good place to start. And okay, so Kant says, ancient Greek philosophy was divided into 3 sections: physics, ethics, and logic. This division fits the nature of the subject perfectly, and there is no need to improve on it, except perhaps by adding the principle on which it is based. By doing so, we may be able, on the one hand, to guarantee its completeness, and on the other, to determine correctly its necessary subdivisions. So 3 disciplines originally were physics, ethics, and logic. So physics, or called natural philosophy, was the philosophical approach to nature. So this isn't physics in the way we would understand it today, where you conduct scientific experimentation. It was rather a kind of trying to understand the structure and content of nature and what constitutes nature, what makes a thing real, what gives a thing its being. So that was physics. And physics, in Kant's mind, would have constituted everything that is concrete, everything that is real, everything that one can objectively interact with through the use of one's senses. Logic, on the other hand, is the opposite. Logic, for Kant, is everything that is abstract. On the one hand, it's the old traditional logic, also founded by Aristotle, who was a real pioneer in the science of logic. It concerned the nature of making arguments, what makes an argument logically consistent, how can one argue in a way that one doesn't make fallacies. This is for Kant the nature of logic, but logic also constitutes the notion of universality. What does it mean to make a statement that's universally binding in every situation? Can one make such a statement? Does the human mind equip us with the potential to make statements that would go to every situation, apply to every situation? Kant would answer in the affirmative, very much in line with the Enlightenment philosophy of his time, which held that the purpose of all human endeavors is to aspire to establish universal principles, which he's going to apply to ethics. He's going to say ethics, if it has any meaning, tries to seek universal principles. That was the third element. So traditionally, ethics in Kant's mind would have been the Aristotelian one, which I already discussed, and also the tradition going back to Plato, which sought to ask questions about what is justice? Is there such a thing as justice? What makes a thing just? Ethics in Kant's mind probably wouldn't have consisted of this contemporary ethical discourse where you're faced with a kind of moral dilemma and then you have to kind of solve the moral dilemma by giving an answer rooted in some ethical notion. Like, for example, the issue a lot of people today are dealing with is the issue of coronavirus, the problem of the virus, and the issue of hospitals, where sometimes maybe there's loads of people who need care but not enough beds. What is the doctor to do? Does the doctor let some people live or let while letting a few die? How does he prioritize, or how does she prioritize which ones to approach? Or is there another approach? I mean, this would be the kind of modern ethics dilemma. This, I think, in Kant's mind would have been a non-issue. This is not the kind of issue. But on the other hand, he would have been thinking about certain questions like death penalty, which was a pressing issue of his time, and people were debating whether or not to abolish the death penalty, which was still in use across the world, and particularly in Prussia, where Kant lived in Königsberg. So these are the three elements of philosophy. Okay, I'll read further now. All rational knowledge is either material and concerned with some object, or formal and concerned with the form of understanding and reason themselves, with the universal rules of thinking as such without regard to differences in its objects. Formal philosophy is called logic, while material philosophy, which has to do with the determinate objects and the laws to which they are subject, is in turn divided into two, since the laws in question are either of nature or of freedom. The science of the first is called physics and the second ethics. The former is also called natural philosophy, the latter moral philosophy. Okay, all rational knowledge is concerned with material. Now, here by material, what Kant effectively means is the content. And content in his theoretical understanding is the kind of internal object that theory interacts with in order to produce a consistent approach to a particular phenomena. Essentially, in Kant's mind, matter was always phenomenal. A material object is not simply, for example, a river or a tree or a book, like I'm holding a book. It's not a body. It's rather the phenomenal appearance in which that material expresses itself. And actually, in Kant's philosophy, Kant thought that human beings didn't possess the ability to have a full understanding of material things. He thought that in every material object, something appears, but at the same time, that very thing that appears doesn't appear. It contains a certain invisibility within the visible itself. And he calls this Ding an sich, the thing in itself. The thing which resists conceptualization, but which appears therefore through the form of a phenomena. And in Kant's understanding, we can have an infinite experience of phenomena, but never a full total experience of that phenomena, because experience is inherently limited by the kind of particular, on the one hand, the particular subjective situation in which experience finds itself in, but also the fact that the human mind is incapable of fully grasping the nature of the material. So rational knowledge is concerned with it, and Kant thought we could interact with nature, we could interact with phenomenal appearances in order to make certain deductions. But on the other hand, he says it's concerned with the formal. And this is where Kant thinks we locate the structure of universality. Kant thought that formal knowledge concerns itself with universal statements that are not dependent on the contingency of the particular phenomenal appearance, but are rather concerned with an abstract universal structure that exceeds any particular experience that one may have. It's essentially the kind of bigger picture behind, to put it in the simplistic language, behind every particular individual thing. So Kant makes a kind of distinction here, and his idea is that universals are always going to be abstract. Universals never contain something concrete. It involves rather the total negation of every concrete object and its transformation into a kind of abstract structure. Okay, and so Kant says that it's concerned with nature or freedom. Now, freedom in Kant doesn't mean this libertarian idea, you're free to do whatever you want. Kant actually says freedom is to do what is necessary. You're totally free to do what you must do. you're free to choose what your duty is to do. Kant says we are effectively bounded by a universal structure that we currently contain in our minds, and we are free to choose whether or not to uh, uh, cooperate with that universal structure. Now, I should say, in Kant's understanding, this isn't something that was created by God or by some divine being. He thinks simply humans are made this way. He thinks humans contain this ability that right and wrong is something that's more or less rational. We'll get to what that means in a bit. Okay, I'll read a little bit more. I may read three full paragraphs just to move on a little bit now. Okay, Kant says logic can have no empirical part, that is, no part in which the universal and necessary laws of thinking are based on grounds taken from experience. As I said, logic for Kant is the total, complete abstraction from everything empirical. There's nothing empirical by which we mean experiential. It's something purely rational and in the mind. Otherwise, it would not be logic. That is, it would not be a canon for understanding and reason, valid for all thinking and capable of demonstration. As against this, both natural and moral philosophy can each have an empirical part. Since the former has to formulate its laws for nature as an object of experience, and the latter for the will of man so far as affected by nature. The first set of laws being those in accordance with which everything happens, the second being those in accordance with which everything ought to happen, although they also take into account the conditions under which what ought to happen very often does not happen. And okay, now this second thing is essentially what Kant will say constitutes the nature of ethics. The laws with which everything should happen for Kant is physics. Physics seeks to establish universal laws in accordance with which all natural phenomena, and he would extend this to social phenomena, must happen. But ethics concerns itself with the universal laws under which everything must happen, but also very often doesn't happen. And it's precisely the human freedom that prevents this ought, this must, this necessity from materializing. Because humans are free to choose what is right and wrong, Kant says, okay, very often they don't choose this. They veer from that. So Kant then says, all philosophy, so far as it rests on the basis of experience, is called empirical philosophy. And he hates this. He's not engaging with empirical philosophy. He's engaging in something quite different. He says, if it sets forth its doctrines as depending entirely on a priori principles, it can be called pure philosophy. Now, a priori, you'll see this term a lot in Kant, means something that is contained within the structure of reason, but which does not need experience in order to express itself. An a priori principle, for example, in Kant's understanding, is the notion of causality. Kant thinks that when I deduce that something happened because of a certain cause, like for example, I have a cough, a really bad cough, and I go to the test location, and this means that I have, it shows that I have a coronavirus. I don't have coronavirus, but if I did, the very deduction that my cough is related to some illness is due to something that doesn't appear within this experiential data, and this is the notion of causality, which Kant thinks is built into our mind. It's something innate, and he thinks pure philosophy, I'm not a fan of this kind of discourse, is something a priori and is innate. It's something we're born with, and it's something that doesn't need experience, but allows experience itself to unfold. He says the latter, by which he means pure philosophy, when wholly formal, is called logic. Wholly formal, he means when it's solely concerned with deducing abstract universal laws, is formal, not related to any particular content. But if it is confined to determinate objects of understanding, it is called metaphysics. So metaphysics in Kant's understanding is not what it meant in pre-Kantian philosophy, where metaphysics is thinking about divine beings, such as God, for example. Actually, it means It simply means the location of universal principles insofar as they relate to empirical concrete objects. So when I ask, how must I act in every particular situation? Is there a universal law that I must follow in every particular situation? Then Kant would say you're engaging in metaphysics because you're deducing from every particular physical, empirical situation in which you might find yourself in order to deduce a set of universal principles that would apply in each particular constellation, each particular situation. Okay, so Kant says, in this way there arises the idea of a twofold metaphysics, a metaphysics of nature and a metaphysics of morals. Thus, physics will have its empirical part, but it will also have a rational one. So actually, this is kind of important. There's a whole branch of philosophy called the philosophy of science. And the philosophy of science doesn't engage in scientific experimentation. It doesn't do any of that because it's not science. It's the philosophy of science. It is the rational part of physics, to use Kant's discourse. If he had a discord, it would be interesting to see what he would have said on the discord. The discourse here, a rational discourse would, for example, try to say, okay, when a scientist does an experiment, what concepts are they relying on that guide their activity? What underlying preconceived notions are they using in order to engage in scientific experimentation? This is the empirical aspect of a metaphysics of a physics, right? But the rational one is this metaphysical notion in Kant. It's precisely what Kant's doing. Okay, and then he says, and likewise ethics, although here the empirical part might be called practical anthropology, the rational part might properly be called morals. So what Kant's here actually saying, all this stuff Aristotle did in the past and things ethics did in the past, such as, make a whole list of virtues and then try to say, well, if you act in this way, then you'll act virtuously, and if you accumulate loads of virtues, you'll be happy. Kant calls this practical anthropology. And he thinks, indeed, this is the concrete part of ethics, and the whole of philosophy has done a decent job of more or less spelling out what these things are. But he doesn't want to do this. He thinks ethics, because he's a rationalist, actually must engage in a rationalist discourse, and this he calls morals. And the metaphysics of morals is precisely this abstraction from concrete situations in order to deduce universal laws. In other words, what Kant wants to do is he wants to treat moral behavior in the same way a scientist might treat physical or natural behavior. In the same way that Newton sought to draw laws of nature, Kant wants to draw laws of morality that would be binding on human beings in all situations. That's what Kant more or less is here seeking to do. Let's see if I want to skip some of this. Yeah, okay, I'll read a little bit more now. I hope this part is not getting too boring. All industries, arts, and crafts have gained by the division of labor. That is to say, one man no longer does everything, but each confines himself to a particular task, differing markedly from others in its technique, so that he may be able to perform it with the highest perfection and with greater ease. Okay, this is a principle deduced from the philosopher Adam Smith, who actually I think may have come after Kant, but Adam Smith very much was a kind of bourgeois economist who had a lot to say about the greatness of the division of labor and the way that capitalism expands the division of labor and thereby confines every working person to a particular task, and through this division of labor perfects it. Kant is here more or less, kind of elaborating on that bourgeois notion, which was popular in his time and which Kant was very much a believer in. He says, where tasks are not so distinguished and divided, where every man is a jack of all trades, their industry is still sunk in utter barbarism. He's talking here about feudalism, where the worker is still tied to his own means of production, where, for example, a peasant owns his land and owns his own machinery, and produces his own food and consumes it, and isn't thereby working for someone else, in which the division of labor has achieved a lower state of development due to um, a lower level of development of the productive forces. Okay, Kant uses this somewhat problematic Orientalist notion of barbarism, but essentially he thought that this is what feudalism was, which was still dominant across Europe in his time. In itself, it might well be a subject noteworthy of examination if we asked whether pure philosophy in all its parts does not demand its own special craftsman. So Kant's done something very interesting here. He says in the same way that, for example, the clothes maker, the person who makes, in his time, you still had people that were a specialist tailor who would make coats, very high quality ones, and was a specialist in that, had a special sense of tools and a special knowledge. Kant thinks a philosopher, too, is a kind of craftsman. He's here formulating a notion of philosophy as a kind of theoretical production. The philosopher is a kind of producer, almost a kind of worker, who has the unique ability to engage in precisely the production of universal laws. This is what Kant here is kind of formulating. Okay, he says, would it not be better for the whole of this learned industry if those accustomed to purvey in accordance with the public taste a mixture of the empirical and the rational in various proportions, unknown even to themselves, the self-styled creative thinkers, as opposed to the hair-splitters who attended to purely rational part, were to be warned against carrying on at once two jobs very different in their technique, each perhaps requiring a special talent and the combination of both in one person producing mere bunglers, whatever this, to be honest, I have no idea what this word means. This sounds like an old translation. Here, however, I confine myself to asking whether the nature of science does not always require that the empirical part should be scrupulously separated from the rational one, and that the empirical physics proper should be prefaced by a metaphysics of nature, while the practical anthropology should be prefaced by a metaphysics of morals, each metaphysics having to be scrupulously cleansed of everything empirical, if we are to know how much pure reason can accomplish in both cases and from what sources it can by itself draw its own a priori teaching. I leave it an open question whether the latter business is to be conducted by all moralists or only by those who feel a vocation for the subject. Okay, what Kant here is doing, he's engaging in what Marxist theory has called the separation of intellectual from manual labor, which Marxism has demonstrated is an effect of the capitalist mode of production, which was on the rise in Kant's time. Kant was living at a time when the French Revolution had happened in Europe, and capitalism was in an early phase of development in France. It was a predominantly industrial capitalism there, where the majority of the means of production were centralized in the hands of the industrialist bourgeoisie, while the majority of the population was being proletarianized and transformed into workers, where the industrialist bourgeoisie solely engaged in intellectual labor, meaning in this case the labor of supervision, of investment, of economic activity, while the majority of the working class, the working people, many of who had been former peasants and who had been driven off their land, and were centered in the big cities in France and later in England, and then later in the late 19th century in Germany, as well as in the Netherlands, in Belgium, and Italy, the rest of Europe. So the majority of people engaging in manual labor. And what Marxist theory has shown is that this separation is the expression of the separation of the worker from the means of production. The worker no longer owns their own machinery, their own land, and thereby are forced to go seek employment for a capitalist who will use their labor power in order to gain what Marx called surplus value and thereby gain a profit. And what Kant has here done is, some might say, unconsciously articulated the ideological notion of the early bourgeois meaning capitalist development of his time. He expresses here a certain identification with it, viewing empirical ethics, namely the ethics concerned with virtue and with happiness and with concrete situations, as the working man's occupation, and his kind of abstract rationalist universalist discourse as the discourse of the bourgeoisie, as the discourse of that section of society who is separated from production and thereby engaged solely in intellectual labor. Okay, so this would be my kind of Marxist analysis of what Kant is doing here. Okay, you may disagree with me, but it's fine, and you can disagree with me if you want. But what I'm trying to explain here is that Kant is to some extent articulating a certain social and material relationship within his text that was dominant in the time in which he was writing. Right? And he's essentially establishing here that it's necessary to cleanse ethics, using the word cleanse. I don't like this language of cleansing. It has a very negative connotation for me. Cleanse the ethics of everything empirical. And think solely, what should I do? What should I do in all situations? Okay, that's what Kant is doing here. Okay, I'm going to go a little bit more, and then I'm going to finish. Almost through this. Since my aim here is directed strictly to moral philosophy, I limit my proposed question to this point only. Do we not think it a matter of the utmost necessity to work out for once a pure moral philosophy completely cleansed of everything that can only be empirical and appropriate to anthropology? That there must be such a philosophy is already obvious from the common idea of duty and from the laws of morality. Everyone must admit that a law has to carry with it absolute necessity if it is to be valid morally. Valid, that is, as a ground of obligation, that the command, you shouldn't lie, could not hold merely for individuals or human beings, other rational beings having no obligation to abide by it, and similarly with all other genuine moral laws. That here, consequently, the ground of obligation must be looked for, not in the nature of man, nor in the circumstances of the world in which he is placed, but solely a priori in the concepts of pure reason, and that every other precept based on principles of mere experience, and even a precept that may in a certain sense be considered universal, so far as it rests in its slightest part, perhaps only in its motive, on empirical grounds, can indeed be called a practical rule, but never a moral law. Okay, what Kant's saying here is that common discourse already speaks about universal laws, things that we learn, or that at least he learned. There's evidence. Kant apparently very much looked down upon people who lied. He had this view that you should tell the truth in every situation, irrespective of the circumstances. And there's a kind of somewhat amusing, kind of ridiculous text that Kant wrote where he defends the idea that you should even tell the truth to a murderer. Basically, he gives this scenario. He says, suppose that you are hiding someone in your house who came to seek shelter with you because they were fleeing a murderer. Remember, in Kant's time, he's living in the area called Königsberg, which was Prussia at the time. Little village, and there's a murderer out, and this guy comes and he seeks help from you, and you say, okay, I'll hide you. And you're hiding this person, maybe hiding him in the basement. Okay, Kant says now the murderer knocks on your door and says, are you hiding this person? Do you know where this person is? Kant says you have to tell the truth, because if you want to truly be moral, you have to hold to the principle, thou shalt not lie, even in this situation. Of course, it raises the question: why would you open the door in the first place to a murderer? Why wouldn't you lock the door and But he thinks this is a real issue, and Kant says you have to tell the truth. And he thought the reason for this was he thought that basically this is the reason also. Besides being a universal command, he thought that the social contract was founded on the principle that people have to tell the truth. And that if someone lies, this can break the very foundation of the social contract and cause the whole of society to fall apart. So if I lie to the murderer, I've broken the social contract, and thereby I commit an even greater crime than enabling the murderer to conduct his evil deed of killing people. I've thereby called into question the whole kind of social fabric by lying. And Kant says, therefore, I should just be honest, because number one, I can't know how the murderer will take my declaration. If I'm just honest with him, maybe he'll take my honesty as a sincere gesture and leave, or maybe he'll think I'm bluffing and leave. But most likely he'll just kill you, of course, and then pursue the person he's looking for. Also, I can't know how the person that I'm hiding, I can't know what they're doing. Kant says, while I'm at the door with the murderer, the person who I'm hiding could have, jumped out of the back window. And therefore, if I'm just honest, it's the best thing I can do. And that's, really, Kant gets into this kind of situation. This is a major issue in Kantian ethics, is that it's so universalist, it's inflexible and can't respond to particular situations. Now, some commentators, other Marxist commentators, have argued that Kant's inflexibility was very much an expression of the inflexibility of the rising bourgeois class of his time, who needed to stand fast and hold to particular principles in order to carry out the bourgeois revolution of overthrowing feudalism, as was the case in France, where the Jacobins used a certain kind of extreme level of violence and terror in order to carry out the French Revolution, and didn't distinguish between any particularities, simply conducted a set of universal principles in order to conduct the revolution, and that Kant is very much an expression of this. But some commentators have pointed out, for example, this thing that Kant says about the social contract, and how if you lie, you break the social contract. I've called into the point that legislation exists in order to respond to particular violations of a social contract. So that, for example, if you break a contract, there's legislation that can, of course, punish you, and you might have to pay a fine or do cell time, go to prison. If you break a law, that the law prevents particular violations of the law, and that Kant was mistaken in saying that it was based on truth telling. Now, of course, Kant lived in a small kind of village, basically. He didn't live in a unified state necessarily. He lived in the Prussian Empire, and he didn't live with a civil society. And therefore, it might very much have been the case that Kant believed that everything around him in his little village was based on honesty. But this Kant thinks is the object of ethics, is these universal principles. So he says, thus in practical knowledge as a whole, not only are moral laws, together with their principles, essentially different from all the rest in which there is some empirical element, but the whole of moral philosophy is based entirely on the part of that which is pure. When applied to man, it does not borrow in the slightest from acquaintance with him, but gives him laws a priori as a rational being. These laws admittedly require, in addition, a power of judgment sharpened by experience, partly in order to distinguish the cases to which they apply, partly to procure for them admittance to the will of man and influence over practice. For man, affected as he is by so many inclinations, is incapable of the idea of a pure practical reason, but he has not so easily the power to realize the idea in concrete in his conduct of life. So again, he's just establishing that we have a priori principles in our mind, and his job as a philosopher is to try to figure out what those things are, and that you shouldn't base ethics on concrete, empirical things. That's interesting what he's saying here. I'm going to move on. A metaphysics of morals is thus indispensably necessary, not merely in order to investigate from motives of speculation the sources of practical principles which are present a priori in our reason, but because morals themselves expose to corruption of all sorts, as long as this guiding thread is lacking, this ultimate norm for correct moral judgment. He thinks that if we don't take the time to figure out how to construct universal moral principles, how can I use my reason to find a set of principles by which I can live my life and act in all particular situations, he thinks that that will lead to a kind of corruption, and that will make me incapable of truly acting moral. And that even if I've studied what he calls practical anthropology, if I've studied Aristotle's ethics, and I've thought about all the different ways that I can conduct myself morally and be virtuous, if I don't have a correct, rational starting point, then all those virtues could actually be used for evil. I could, for example, use courage not to conduct myself in a way that I act with duty, but I can use my courage to engage in sinister kind of evil actions. And therefore, he thinks it's necessary. For if any action is to be morally good, this is a very important passage, it is not enough that it should conform to the moral law. It must also be done for the sake of the moral law. Now, that is a fundamental principle in Kant. Something conforms to the moral law when it could be said that it could apply universally. It's just I myself haven't acted because I see it as my necessity to do so. So, although rational analysis might expose the act to a universal principle, my action might have been motivated by personal desire or a belief in the goodwill of humanity or the desire to improve society. Let me give just a really simple example. Suppose that there's a huge COVID outbreak somewhere, and there's not enough healthcare workers to respond to the situation, and the state calls upon volunteers to come out and help with the situation. And I volunteer to do that. Kant says that, well, okay, I would say, well, I'm doing that because people are in need, and, well, my individual participation might help the situation, might contribute to the collective response. I'm just an individual, but collectively we can all respond by all volunteering. Well, Kant says if you analyze that, the underlying principle might be, well, okay, you should help your fellow human being. Kant says, can the principle, you should help your fellow human being, can this be universalized? Is there a situation in which it would not make sense to help your fellow human being? If indeed it is the case that there is no such situation, then help your fellow human being is a universal principle, because there's no situation in which it would make sense to not act in that way. Now, if I'm simply acting because I want to help people and I think the particular situation demands it, my individual participation in a COVID volunteer campaign could help society. Kant says, well, that will conform to that principle. You should help your fellow human being. But my motivation isn't motivated by this abstract principle because I don't have one. I'm just simply responding because I think this particular situation, it would be a good thing to do. Kant thinks what we should do as philosophers is take a step back and try to figure out what these universal principles are, so we won't even have to think about it in that way. That we'll simply act in every situation out of the principle, you should always help your fellow human being. It no longer becomes a question of what will result from my action or how will it make me feel. It may very well be that the action will be tiresome and unpleasant. It will take a lot of time. Um, but Kant would say that I need to do it irrespective of the of how it makes me feel. So that's the distinction. Moral conformity is when I'm acting in such a way where my action could correspond to a moral principle, but acting for the sake of the moral law is acting in accordance with principles that I try to follow in every situation. In other words, I never act in a way that I make exceptions for myself. He says, where this is not so, the conformity is only too contingent and precarious, since the non-moral ground at work will now and then produce actions which accord with law, but very often actions which transgress it. And he thinks that he doesn't think that concrete situations, such as the COVID situation, can in any way cause me to act morally. This situation is not one that is universalizable. It's solely dependent on the particularity of the COVID situation. Kant thinks that doesn't provide material for universal analysis. He thinks only reason can kind of do this. Okay, I'm going to quickly get through this because the video's been going on now for a while. I'm going to just kind of read a bit and then come to the conclusion. Now the moral law, in its purity and genuineness, and in the field of action is where this matters most, is to be looked at for nowhere else than in pure philosophy. Hence, pure philosophy, that is metaphysics, must come first, and without it there can be no moral philosophy at all. Indeed, a philosophy which mixes up with pure principles with empirical ones does not deserve the name of philosophy, since philosophy is distinguished from ordinary rational knowledge because it sets forth in a separate science what the latter apprehends only as confused with other things. Still less does it deserve the name of moral philosophy, since by this very confusion it undermines even the purity of morals themselves and acts against its own proper purpose. So Kant thinks that moral philosophy, pure abstract rationalism, should act as a kind of vanguard, in theory, that guides all practical moral discourse. He thinks philosophers are essentially revolutionary theorists that stand at the forefront of every ethical question and do so not by responding to particulars, but by constructing principles that every particular could use to respond to a situation. And he thinks it's absolutely a mistake to include empirical philosophy in pure philosophy and pure philosophy in empirical philosophy. I don't like this distinction, but it's one that Kant makes. Okay, I'm going to skip here a little bit and go to the next page because a lot of this gets redundant. Intending, as I do, to publish someday a Metaphysics of Morals, I issue this groundwork in advance. For metaphysics, there is strictly no other foundation than the critique of pure practical reason, just as for metaphysics, there is no other foundation than the critique of pure speculative reason, which I have already published. By the way, this is called The Critique of Pure Reason. It's a massive work. It's quite difficult to read, but you might take a look at it when you have free time. Yet, on the other hand, there is not the same extreme necessity for the former critique as for the latter, since human reason can, in matters of morality, be easily brought to a high degree of accuracy and precision, even in the most intelligence, whereas in the theoretical but pure activity, it is, on the contrary, out and out dialectical. And on the other hand, the critique of practical reason, if it is to be complete, requires, on my view, that we should be able at the same time to show the unity of practice and theoretical reason in a common principle, since in the end there can only be one and the same reason which must be differentiated in its application. Here, however, I found myself yet unable to bring to work such completeness without introducing these considerations. Okay, one last kind of matter before I get to the conclusion. Kant thinks actually that in ethics, it's very often the case that we can construct what the French philosopher Louis Althusser called practical concepts, concepts that contain universal principles, but in which practice exceeds and moves ahead of theory, in which we can engage in practice, engage in moral action without having a worked out kind of theoretical system at our disposal. He thinks, therefore, it is possible to construct practical concepts. For example, the notion, which was predominant at his time, you should not kill, for example, which is predominant in all many societies, is a practical concept. It's contained in biblical texts, it's contained in other religious texts, such as the Quran, it's contained in Buddhism, it is the principle of many different discourses, but it's practical in the sense that it allows one to have a principle that governs lawmaking, that governs behavior and action, but without having a worked out theoretical reason. Why should one refrain from using violence, or why should one refrain from killing? What is the reason for this? And obviously we could throw up many practical lists. It causes human suffering, it's unfair, it creates an oppressive environment for people. But Kant thinks there's more abstract, universal reasons that don't require any of those examples, but could serve as a more solid foundation for lawmaking and for decision making. So that's the way in which practice, right? A legislator can write a law that penalizes murder or violence or attempted murder without necessarily having a whole set of philosophical reasons for doing so. The job of philosophy, as Louis Althusser very correctly understood, was to intervene into this discourse and to draw a line of demarcation between the ideological and the scientific. And this is essentially what Kant wants to do, is he wants to expose the moral discourse of his time as being more or less ideological and tied to the contingency of the particular situation, and to produce a scientific discourse that would allow for an approach to moral questions founded in universalist discourse. Now, I personally don't think that what Kant did was in any sense scientific. I think it was in fact just as ideological as many of his foregrounders. In fact, much of Kant's philosophy is founded in the tradition of colonialism and imperialism, which was very much on the rise in Kant's time. Many of his ideas are rooted in the development of the bourgeois revolution sweeping Europe at the time. But I think that nonetheless, this distinction between practical concepts and theoretical ones, between ideological and scientific notions, is a just one and is very helpful for any kind of philosophical inquiry which responds to the situation in such a way as to introduce more clarity and to distinguish between what is more or less ideological and what could be more consistent and theoretical and structural. Okay, now coming to the conclusion. I'm almost at the end. But in the third place, since the Metaphysics of Morals, in spite of its horrifying title, or I think he's being humorous here because it sounds very difficult, can be in a high degree popular and suited to the ordinary intelligence, I think useful to issue separately this preparatory work on its foundation, so that later I need not insert the subtleties inevitable in these matters into doctrines more easy to understand. So what Kant is trying to do here is issue a kind of popular pamphlet. Pamphlets were a big deal at the time. A philosophical pamphlet that he thought the leaders of the bourgeois revolutions of his time in France, in England, all across Europe, and that could be studied by the popular masses, by working people, but also by industrialists, by shopkeepers, and that could be understood by anybody who took the time to study his writings. So this text is very much written in a kind of populist style. Kant thinks, at least, he's doing it, but when you read the text, you'll find it's very far from that, and that it is indeed a very difficult text that does require a good amount of study. Okay, now coming to the last two paragraphs, and then I'll finish the video. The sole aim of the present groundwork is to seek out and establish the supreme principle of morality. This by itself is a business which by its very purpose constitutes a whole and has to be separated from every other inquiry. The application of the principle to the whole system would no doubt throw much light on my answers to this central question, so important and yet hitherto so far from being satisfactorily discussed, and the adequacy it manifests throughout would afford its strong confirmation. All the same, I had to forego this advantage, which in any case would be more flattering to myself than helpful to others, since the convenience of a principle in use and its seeming adequacy afford no completely safe proof of its correctness. They rather awaken a certain bias against examining and weighing in all its strictness for itself without any regard to its consequences. The method I have adopted in this book is, I believe, one which will work best if we proceed analytically from common knowledge to the formulation of its supreme principle, and then back again synthetically from an examination of this principle and to its origins to the common knowledge in which we find its application. So, the three chapters, which I'll make a video about each of them, passage from ordinary rational knowledge of a morality to the philosophical. So the first chapter is going to be concerned with exposing the ordinary moral understanding of the average person, the average ideological discourse, to a more philosophical level. The second chapter seeks to pass from the popular moral discourse to a metaphysics of morals. So here he draws a distinction between, on one hand, Aristotle and some of the utilitarian philosophers of his time, as well as many medieval theorists, and himself, and some of his followers, such as Christian Wolff. And then the third chapter, he looks at the final step from a metaphysics of morals to a critique of pure practical reason. And so this is the book. That's what he's trying to do here. I think it's a good idea to carefully read each chapter, take some notes, take the time to read it, take some time to think about it. It may very well be that you read Kant and you have absolutely no idea what he means. Well, it's no problem. Join the club, because there's many people that have read Kant many times and still don't understand, including many scholars. And there's many debates, there's many books written about Kant, there's many articles, many texts, many YouTube videos. So if you don't think you understand Kant, don't be alarmed. Just trust your own ability and go with what you think. Read Kant and think, based on what have I read, what does he mean? What do I think he means, at least? And try to explain it. Kant was a believer that all of us possess the ability to understand, and therefore you should trust this ability. Try to understand and really kind of struggle with the text a little bit, and hopefully you'll get something out of it. I think the point of these kind of texts is not necessarily to have a full understanding of Kantian ethics, but to really be able to think more critically about a wide variety of moral phenomena and so forth. Okay, that's the video. I'll end right here now. I will be making more in the future.